If they've come back stronger from doing a set to failure, you haven't fatigued them enough to stimulate a growth response. You haven't created enough microtrauma. And now we can actually look at various genes. There are genes that point to some people are extremely microtrauma resistant, while other people create or experience a lot of microtrauma, even just with a single set of an exercise.
Welcome to Corporate Warrior, the podcast that brings you the best advice on how to improve your health, optimize performance, and maximize productivity. With your host, Lawrence Neal.
This podcast is brought to you by HitUni.com. HitUni are a provider of amazing online courses for high-intensity training qualifications. HitUni comes highly recommended by the best in the field, including Body by Science author Dr. Doug McGuff, Discover Strength CEO Luke Carlson, and trainer Drew Bay. It was founded by my friend, author, and longtime personal trainer Simon Shawcross. Simon has 15 years' experience training clients and has supervised over 15,000 high-intensity training workouts. Using knowledge from experts like Skylar Tanner, Dr. James Steele, and Dr. Ellington Darden, HitUni is a goldmine for learning everything to do with high-intensity training. The courses are delivered online through the website, where you can learn via a variety of multimedia materials at your own pace. There's online support and a discussion forum where you can share ideas and ask for help. To learn more about high-intensity training and improve my own results, I started their personal trainer course. The content is amazing, and the courses are really easy to follow, and each section is organized into bite-sized chunks that give you a real sense of achievement after you complete each one. I should also mention that there is a DIY course. So this is the course for you if you're not necessarily a personal trainer, but you want to learn more about high-intensity training and how to implement it for maximum benefit in your own exercise regimen. To get your exclusive Corporate Warrior 10% discount on any course you purchase, simply head on over to hituni.com, that's hituni.com, and enter the coupon code CW10. That's CW and the number 10. So again, that's hituni.com, pick your course, and enter the coupon code CW10. Thank you for your support. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Corporate Warrior with your host, Lawrence Neal. This podcast is my journaling quest to understand how to better optimize productivity in health, career, business, and lifestyle. My guests include health and fitness giants like Ben Greenfield and Rob Wolf, underground, rarely interviewed exercise experts like David Landau, HIIT specialists like Dr. Doug McGuff, athletes like former pro boxer Tony Jeffries, New York Times best-selling authors, highly successful business owners, startup founders, bloggers, finance experts, and so on. Following popular demand, my next guest is Ryan Hall. Ryan Hall is a major partner of Exercise Science LLC, a HIIT fitness facility based in New Orleans. He has a bachelor's and master's in exercise physiology and has over 25 years experience in the health and fitness industry. I came to know Ryan online through the Body by Science group on Facebook, and then I came to learn that he contributed to chapters 3 and 8 in Body by Science with regard to the ever important yet often overlooked genetic factor. And I've read Body by Science probably 3 or 4 times, and I was surprised that I'd not recognized his name since it's in there in those chapters. In this interview, we cover Ryan's background and his fruitless attempt to try and reap the benefits of high-volume workouts promoted by Arnold Schwarzenegger back in the day, and what he learned from his mistakes. We talk about Ryan's personal results and how they improved when he worked out less and less. We get into the significant genetic variation in individuals, which determines the training response and can help identify which workout protocols are best suited to get the job done. We talk about how body types don't always determine workout protocols and much, much more. We do get stuck into the weeds on this one. We get quite technical, but Ryan does an excellent job in elegantly articulating the complexities of exercise science to make it easier for everyone to understand, including myself. For all the show notes for this episode and all episodes, please go to 15minutecorporatewarrior.com/podcast. And now I give you Ryan Hall. So, Ryan, thank you very much for coming on the show. Excited to talk and dig into some of your research on exercise. I just wanted to kick off by asking you, for those that aren't familiar with you and your work, could you just provide a summary of your background and the kind of work you've been involved in the past and currently?
Sure. My degrees, both undergrad and graduate, are in exercise physiology. I used to work that's from the University of New Orleans. I did work in the exercise phys lab there. I've been training people since I was 18 years old, when I started working at a local Nautilus gym, toying around with weights well before then. I've had several different capacities before opening up my own studio when I was 24 years old. The name of that was One-to-One Personal Training. We were in business, had a business partner for 18 years, and about 3 years ago, we decided to go our own way. And that's when I opened up Exercise Science LLC. Really with sort of, we'll train anyone and can train anyone, but really with more of the goal of looking at two growing populations in the United States and probably worldwide that are being underserved. And that is our seniors. Because of the baby boomers, we have a rapidly expanding elderly population. And the rehabilitation or post-rehabilitation market, or population where, people they go through a few weeks or months of physical therapy, and then they're given, some exercise to do at home. And that's kind of a prescription for failure. And that's at least been my experience. I've done a lot of research postgraduate. I've always stayed with my nose into the research literature. That's what really makes me happy, for the most part. And so I've done work with sarcopenia, the physiology of aging. My main study was muscle physiology. And I also really got into the biomechanics, not biomechanics, I should say. Yes, we did look at biomechanics, but actually the newer research is in molecular biology and genetics. And, there's a story that goes along with that, Lawrence, but when I thought I found the answer for me, I had mistakenly assumed, this was very many years ago, that I'd found the answer for everyone. And that was clearly not. And so I spent pretty much the rest of my career, and it didn't happen until maybe around 2005, 2006, when all the genes were discovered that were basically strongly correlating with an individual's ability to adapt and tolerate an exercise stimulus. And I guess that's where my largest work has been since then, is in the actual genetics research.
Cool. And that's what you've been focused on most currently, is it the genetics side of things?
Yeah. And, Lawrence, because if more people knew about that, the genetics research, there would no longer be an argument between high volume or higher volume and lower volume, high intensity, because the genetics literature clearly answers those questions.
Oh, that's an exciting thing to bring up and talk about. Just curious though, before we go there, you mentioned the populations that you're addressing in your business, which is very interesting to me. What has worked for you guys in terms of actually attracting the older population to and those interested in rehab? How have you attracted those two populations to exercising at your facility?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that, because some of it is just by the nature. I've been doing this for so long. I actually have people that I've been training since I was 18. And obviously they're older. So I'm 45 now. And that means they're going to be, at least in their 60s. I train people in their 70s, 80s, even 90s. We had someone as old as 96. Yeah, and it's interesting because both my parents are diabetic. Okay, so I know what my genetics are for that. And I see what happens when you either do or do not take care of yourself. My father is currently he's 64 years old, and he's in a nursing home, and he needs an amputation. And he's got every physiological problem you can imagine, and he probably won't live much longer. On the other hand, my mom does take care. She does come to my studio and train with one of my guys once a week, and she does stay active, and she's great. And I train people in their 80s that have much better health and functional capacity than my father, who's very much younger, 30 years younger. And so I see what can happen when you take care of yourself. And so I think just the nature of what we do and the equipment we have, obviously we have the whole line of MedX and the spine care technology line. And I'd say about half the work I do is from rehabilitation or prehab, which I would call it, and people with various injuries. And so what's interesting, what happened in New Orleans, we were the first personal training studio open up in 1996. And this is in uptown New Orleans. It's the highest per capita income in the city, median per capita income in our 70115 zip code. And so now every block there's a fitness facility. And so my strategy, which has worked thus far really, really well, was just to become more of a niche market. And so that is where I've been headed since then.
Right, yeah. It's just when you do that, you just speak directly to those people, don't you? When you niche down like that. Yeah. Absolutely. Good. Okay. And sorry to hear about your father, but thank you for sharing that, because it's profound when you hear stuff like that, and I think a lot of people can obviously relate to that. In terms of, I want to start off, I guess, talking about some exercise science and research stuff, and I had some excellent questions submitted by listeners, and lately it helps me hugely because it almost makes my it does a lot of the preparation for me, because a lot of my listeners are really clued up on this stuff, and have some really, really thought-provoking questions to submit. So one of those was, if the principles of exercise are set in stone, as Body by Science seems to make out, why is it that researchers such as Brad Schoenfeld, who was on the podcast recently, seem to draw different conclusions than many in the high-intensity training camp?
That is an excellent question, honestly. And so I have my thoughts about that, okay? And one of the conclusions I came after giving my genetics lecture was all canned exercise programs should be null and void. And honestly, it's my personal opinion that if exercise studies don't contain a genetic component, then it's not all that useful. I'll just put it that way. And that's putting it nicely, okay? I have other thoughts on that, though, in that in research, there's something in throughout life. There's something called selection or survivorship bias, okay, where we naturally gravitate to things that we do well. All right. Let me give you a little anecdote from my own perspective, okay, and then I guess I can dig into the research question. So, years ago, when I was 14, I started touring around with my father's weight set. I sustained an injury playing intramural volleyball, a lateral ligament sprain, which effectively ended my sports career when I was about 16. Not that I had much of a sports career, because I didn't have that great genetic. I was just small. I was strong, but I was small. And anyway, so that's when I started to get more serious. And of course, the only research literature that anybody has access to when they're a teenager are bodybuilding magazines, which are high volume, multiple set, split routines and stuff. So, my friends and I, we followed whatever was in the bodybuilding magazines. And later I started buying books. I didn't adapt well at all, not at all, to those high volume routines, not even a little bit. And, I bought every book out there, and if Arnold Schwarzenegger's book of modern day bodybuilding said you need to go to the gym 6 days a week, I was going to go to the gym 6 days a week, and I wound up not getting stronger. I wound up injured. And it's funny, Lawrence, because everything that I learned happened to me because of somewhat need, not because I was smart enough to figure it out. I was going to the gym 6 days a week, not making any results. But if Arnold said, You keep doing it, and it's eventually going to come. It was Einstein that said, if you keep doing the same thing over and expecting a different result, that's insanity. So I kept going, and I kept going, and I never made any results from that. And what was funny is, when I would get busy with school, this was like my freshman year of college, when I would get busy with school, I'd have to skip a week off, or 6 days, or whatever the case may be. And I'd go back to the gym, and I would be stronger. And I didn't get it. I didn't understand it. And so, by happenstance, before I started working, again, this is right in college, we had a family membership with my aunt, and my aunt did not renew the family membership. So I just had to work out at home with my own weights. And I was working 2 or 3 jobs and going to college full time. And it was just impossible to find time. So I started training with just basic movements, like I can actually tell you what my routine was from way back when I was 18 years old. I would do 3 sets of deadlifts, 3 sets of bent over rows, 3 sets of chest press, overhead press, barbell curl, and end with 3 sets of squats. And I did that 3 days a week. And I actually made better results than I had ever previously made before. And then I got busier, so I had to cut back even more. So I did 2 sets of each exercise twice a week. And my results were even better. And I did not understand what the hell was going on, although I was learning rapidly. That's when I started working at Heritage Sports Center, which was a local Nautilus club, and I got introduced to the Nautilus training principles. And it was like, wow, okay, this makes a lot of sense now. This is exactly what I've been experiencing. I didn't know it was called HIIT or high intensity training or anything about super slow at the time or anything like that. But I started to think much more like a scientist by looking at a routine and training and changing only one variable at a time. Okay, instead of slapping a totally different routine and let's get wild and crazy, it's okay. This was my first Nautilus routine. We had I did the isolation exercises for the upper body. So I did pull over, 10-degree chest, lateral raise, biceps, triceps, and on the multi-exercise machine, we had a squat box, which I still have at my facility now. So we did squats in the squat box. Those are my 6 exercises. We're experimenting with the super slow protocol. So we're doing 6 reps and about 2 minutes. And I got stuck on the lateral raise at 75 pounds. I got stuck, and I couldn't get over 5 reps. And I was stuck for months. And again, because I had to, not because I wanted to, I just got busy with exams, final exams, and I took another week off. And I came back to the gym, and I got 9 reps for 3 minutes on laterals. And that's when the light bulb went off for me. And so I actually went ahead and started scratching the numbers off on the back of the weight stack because I thought someone was screwing with me. That's how long I had been stuck at it. And so, but that's when the light bulb went off that I needed more recovery. And when I ever hit a plateau, I introduced more recovery. And for me, that recovery extended out to 9 or 10 days. And anything past that, at the time was too much recovery, but anything under that was too little.
Sorry to interrupt. When you say too much, what was the impact? That you got weaker or lost muscle mass, or? I
wouldn't get stronger, and I also lost conditioning. Right. So I didn't get weaker, but I didn't continue to get stronger. That was my sort of recovery pattern. Now, I thought, I have the answer for everyone. Okay. So there was a good friend of mine. We grew up together. He lived right across the street from my dad's house, my friend Mike. And Mike responded exceedingly well to high volume training. I mean, to this day, he's still pretty jacked up. Okay. And I mean, I called Mike and I said, Mike, man, I got the answer. Man, I've been training at this place for a while. I've been working here, and I want you to come and start training with me. You don't have to join the club, because I work here. By that time, I was assistant manager, and man, let's start doing it. So I start training him high intensity, and he said, he'd tell me, wow, I just finished I did 5 sets. But Mike did not respond at all. Nothing. He didn't get stronger. He didn't get bigger. Twice a week, once a week, it didn't matter. There was nothing I could do to get him results. When Mike went home and Mike started training in his backyard, doing his lighter weight, high reps, 5 sets per muscle, per exercise, Mike made extreme results, better than I could ever hope to imagine. And that's when I started looking at this saying, maybe this isn't the answer for everyone. And although I still continue training most of my people that way. So what I think happens in research, first of all, and maybe I'm speculating a bit too much here, okay? But I did really enjoy listening to, I am a scientist and I do things by the scientific method. I did really enjoy listening to Brad's podcast. However, I think we're having some selection or survivorship bias happen from that, meaning most of what I had seen, at least reading many of the test subjects, they seem to be younger. And so people that would recover a bit faster. And if you are a professor at a university, and this was true for early exercise research literature, what are the population of people that you're going to have direct access to for research subjects? Well, those people are going to be largely collegiate athletes. And in order to even make it to the collegiate level in athletics, you have to have a certain genetic potential. So the people without that genetic potential have already been weeded out. So I guess my question with that is that a true random sample? And I guess that would be my question, that I really have to go look at some of the studies he's performed, to kind of dig into the deep end of the data and see if I can get my hands on the raw data and look at what his subject population consisted of. It also, though, Lawrence, which is very important, and this is exceedingly important, and we'll talk about this when we go over some more research studies, but every time we look at data, we're looking generally, when we look at a study, we're looking at a mean. We're looking at the average result. But when you start to look at the variation in scores and the inter-individual variability, that becomes a hugely different. Where you see a few people, it's actually positively skewed, where you see a few people who adapt extremely well, and then you actually people, they're called non-responders, but they're actually negative responders, who either don't make any results or who lose strength and muscle from working out with a higher volume routine. So it's really important to look at the variability of scores and the individual variability between the subjects. And if you don't do that, I think you're really doing a disservice by just simply reporting the mean or the average.
Yeah, that was a good answer, and certainly want to dig into a lot of what you've just said there. But the first thing which is kind of coming to my attention is that very interesting story you just told of your friend who, by doing more volume and what sounds like lesser loads or intensity, seemed to get much better results. So do you think it would be appropriate time to go into why you think that is, and perhaps we can talk about the difference between modest intensity responders and how, I guess, different people with different sets of genetics and genotypes respond to training differently in terms of what you've observed and what you found in the research?
Sure, absolutely. So some of the stuff I'm looking at now, and this is very, very interesting to me, are non-responders or people or negative responders. Okay, so and I can give you links to all this if your readers if your listeners are interested.
Please do.
Yeah, and so one of the studies that I looked at did an endurance training program. And what they did was, I think it was 45 minutes, maybe 4 days a week of endurance training. And they separated, when you looked at, one way to go is when you look at the average, it'll often be reported as the mean plus or minus the standard deviation from the mean. And sometimes you'll see this large standard deviation. That means there's a lot of variability, inter-individual variability. So what this study did after they put these subjects on a the endurance training program, they looked at basically high responders and low responders. And at that volume and frequency, there were a number of people who actually got worse, who actually negatively responded, where the oxidative and enzymatic enzymes within the muscle decreased, some transporter proteins for glucose decreased, VO2 max decreased, their performance decreased. And the question is, why is someone exercising to achieve negative results? And that's when those people stop exercising. Now, these same group of researchers later took these subjects that did not respond to endurance training and put them on a resistance training program. And there was a positive response with the resistance training program in the people that did not respond to endurance. A little bit later, these same group of researchers did a crossover design study where they took two groups. One group did high-intensity interval training. One group did the longer time, more frequent endurance training. And they looked at the responders and non-responders from each of those groups. They gave them a 3-month washout period, and then they did a crossover design. So they switched the groups. The group that previously did endurance training did high-intensity interval training, and the group that did high-intensity interval training now did endurance training.
Can you be more specific about the mode? When you say endurance training, what can you define that in this study?
Oh, I'm sorry. So it was, I believe it was on the bicycle. Okay, and we usually do endurance training, the interval training on the bicycle, just because it's a stationary cycle.
Sure.
So you can measure things like, you can measure work and watch. You can look at the heart rate responses. You can measure the electromechanical level. And so the high-intensity interval training in this study, I believe, consisted of 6 20-second sprints, if I'm recalling correctly, spaced with a couple minutes between. And the endurance training was either 45 minutes or an hour, several days per week. But the results from this study were very interesting in that people who were non-responders to endurance training positively respond to the high-intensity interval training. And the people that didn't respond to the high-intensity interval training responded to the endurance training. That was an eye-opener. It was pretty wild. And that's only two sides of the spectrum. You can kind of imagine, and I can provide you with some charts and graphs, it's sort of like a standard bell curve, where someone can fit anywhere along this intensity volume continuum, if you will. Okay?
What were the sorry to interrupt. What were the? I'm just interested in terms of those the markers that they tracked. In terms of what improved and what. I mean, you already mentioned stuff that was negatively affected by people that weren't that didn't use a training protocol successfully. But what were the markers that improved when they, finished a crossover design and looked at the results from those that actually, when they found a protocol that they excelled in, what were the markers that actually improved? Do you remember?
So it really depends upon the study and what they measure. Okay. And so various studies measure various things. Sometimes they'll do muscle biopsies and look at enzyme adaptations, or there are upregulations in that. And other times they'll just test VO2 max, and other times they'll just look at what I think is most important is just performance based. Okay, are these people able to put out more work, train at a higher level? Look at heart rate response. You often see people training at higher intensity levels with a lower heart rate, and then you have a greater recovery heart rate in between intervals or after the training is done. Sometimes they'll look at things like the respiratory exchange ratio, which is also derived from the VO2. You're basically dividing the carbon dioxide you exhale, which is VCO2, by the oxygen you consume, so divided by VO2, which gives you the respiratory exchange ratio. And what that is indicative of, at least at rest and at work actually, is what's the percentage of carbohydrate or fat are you utilizing as a fuel source. And it's interesting because we can actually drift into resistance training with this also, but also resistance training, in addition to high intensity interval training and endurance training, actually show more of a shift to fat metabolism via an increase in oxidative enzyme capacity, along with changes in the actual fibers themselves, and the fast twitch or fast glycolytic fibers to, let's say, type 2X or 2B over to the type 2A fibers, which would be more intermediate kind of fast oxidative glycolytic fibers.
Did you see any? Again, this is probably asking you to try and recall something that is still buried away in the memory somewhere. But did you see any for that group that actually got better results from endurance training than perhaps high intensity interval training? Did you see any improvements in muscle mass? Because that would seem really unusual to me if that were the case in any of the subjects.
No, that wasn't tested in that study. But the next study I'd like to talk about actually looked at variability in, and I'm actually going to click on my genetics lecture here so I can go over this, the variability in strength and size with resistance training. Now, I recall a lot about this study because I talk about it all the time. So what this study did was they took a group of subjects and they put them on a relatively high volume resistance training program. It was 9 total sets for biceps, 3 exercises, 3 sets, and 6 total sets for triceps. Okay. And this was the first study that really looked at the variability. This was in 2005 of results in resistance training. So they measured the cross-sectional area of a muscle and they looked at the arm, and what they actually have, again, I can send you email you some slides from my presentation where what they're doing is they're using a CAT scan in order to measure cross-sectional area. So they'll look at a bony or a soft tissue landmark, and they'll do a CAT scan of before and after training in order to look at the increase in size or cross-sectional area of the muscle. They also looked at strength gains via a 1 repetition max. Also, which I think is a little bit more indicative of true strength gain or loss, they looked at a maximal voluntary contraction, which would be isometric or static. Okay, and this is very interesting. When you looked at the results in increases in cross-sectional area, the average increase was 19%. But the variability is you had a few people, very few, do amazingly well, literally gained up to 60% increase in the cross-sectional area of the upper arm. Wow. That's humongous. But guess what? Some people lost muscle tissue up to 2%.
What was the size of the group? Do you remember that?
You know what? I'm going to have to go back in that study and report that to you later.
Yeah, don't worry.
What I'll do is I'll give you links to all the research studies, and you can list them, and so your listeners can go ahead and grab the data for themselves, because that's what I like to do. Now, with strength, it was even odder, okay? With 1 rep max, the average, now there's skill involved in a 1 repetition maximum. There's much less skill involved in and isometric contraction. Okay, so with the 1 rep max, the average increase in strength was 54%. The variability was no increase and up to 250% increase in 1 rep max. So some people got no strength in their 1 rep max, and other people could literally do 2.5 times more, 250% more. The average result in the maximal isometric contraction was 19.5, and here's the variability. Some people lost up to 32% of their strength, while other people gained 150%. Well, the question is, the way I look at this is, we're not training, there's no such thing as an average human. We're not training averages. I'm training individuals. When someone comes to me, they're not paying me to get them negative results. They're paying me to get them positive results. So I have to figure out, with this person, we apply a stimulus and observe what happens. And it's interesting because in this particular study, the researchers really had no idea as to why this variability existed. So I actually contacted them and asked them how open they were to the idea that some of these people may have been overtrained with doing that high volume. And actually, they were very open to that idea because, as I stated, this is something that I see in my clinical practice every single day. That, yeah, we have. And so what you had with this group of data, and like I said, I will provide you some graphs and slides, is that you had a positive skew. A positive skew won't represent a standard bell curve, but you have a few people that do really well, exceedingly well, that pull that mean forward. Okay?
Yeah.
And so while most people made average results, and some people made even worse results, that positive skew, those genetic freaks, really pulled that mean forward. And so that's why you see this humongous inter-individual variability. But I think it was exceedingly important to look at that variability instead of looking at an average result.
Absolutely. Okay, so this you were alluding to actually just now in terms of how you appreciate the individual variability of your clients' genetics, and you understand that depending on the protocol they use, they'll get could get very, very different results from what you're saying there. So how do you figure that out? So when someone walks into your gym, what is it? You mentioned on email to me that there's some obviously observational hints. If they're particularly, I don't know, perhaps if they're ectomorphic versus being mesomorph, or is it more you have to see how they respond to the actual stimulus? So what?
It's actually. Yeah, it's more about how they respond to the actual stimulus. I've since given up on looking at somebody and seeing if I guess. Now, I should say this. There are some people who are just genetically muscular from the get-go. I mean, there's literally people I could probably throw tomatoes at and they get big. So, we've just seen muscular people, and those people are going to make obviously really, really great results. Now, there's a bit of selection and survivorship bias going on with this also, because when I went to the gym I had gone to, when I was in college, you had a lot of really big guys that did well and adapted to a high volume program, like my friend Mike. You had people like me who were beating their head against the wall and we're not making any results, and we dropped out. Okay? So it's interesting because for me, I became obsessed with something I didn't do well at. And it was for me a continual search for something that did work for me. Now, if you think about this from a population perspective, if people are going to the gym that have great genetics already, and they're tossing some weight around, they're not really on a structured program, and they get results, that person is not going to even look for a trainer. I mean, a personal trainer is not going to be in their radar. Why do they need to pay for something that they're already making great results from? So a large amount of the people that trainers are going to pull from are people who don't know how to do it on their own, right? Or don't feel comfortable, or didn't make results doing it on their own. So we're also pulling from we're also having selection or survivorship bias. Most of our clients are going to be people with average to below average genetic potential. So keeping that in mind, that's when we start to look for applying the stimulus and looking for the result. And the result I'm looking for is, as long as someone is getting stronger, then we have our objective measurement of improvement. The subjective measurements are, do I feel bigger today? Is my bicep harder? Can I flex more? In science, we're not interested in subjective measurements. We're only interested in objective measurements. And the strongest subjective measurement that we have is an increase in strength. As long as that client is getting stronger, then we're doing something right. Now, you would think that, okay, mesomorph, ectomorph, endomorph, okay, we can, the thinner people are going to be better at endurance. The more muscular, larger people are probably going to be better at strength. That's actually not true. You can't really look at someone and be able to determine their fiber type distribution. And this is something that we do all the time. And some of the early work that Jones did with the isokinetic servo-powered Nautilus devices, and also a little later on with the Medex devices. But I'll give you some real easy examples, okay? Now, if we look at a standard bell curve, right, plus or minus one standard deviation from the mean includes about 66% of the population. So most people are going to do decent with that standard time under load. Let's say 1.5 minutes to 2.5 minutes, something like that, or 2 minutes is what we generally look at. However, if you have someone that's more on the oxidative end of the spectrum, or slow twitch, slow oxidative, right? They have more endurance-based fiber and not as much strength-based muscle fibers. They're not going to be able to lift a heavy load. There's this one woman, her name is Mary Lee, that trained at another facility that did high-intensity, super slow training before she came to our facility. And so I'm thinking, okay, she's been trained for a while. I put her on our Medex row at 140, and she couldn't budget. Okay, so we're looking at, 140 wasn't even her one repetition maximum. I put her on 120, and she was on for over 4 minutes.
Oh, wow.
That's also very, very correlates very strongly to some of the research that Jones did. He at first called it anaerobic endurance. Later he called it fatigue response, although there was never any muscle biopsies done to confirm, which is one thing I'd like to do. I'd like to get one of those medical knee machines and actually have muscle biopsies taken from the vastus lateralis to see if we can strongly correlate. But Jones speculated that this anaerobic endurance or fatigue response strongly correlated to their fiber type distribution. And that's what my speculation is also. And so, yes, while muscle has a high degree of plasticity and can adapt depending on how it's trained, you will make best results if you train with what you're originally given or what you're originally born with, because there's only so far through exercise that those fibers can actually adapt to either oxidative or endurance or strength. Now, you'll have someone with the complete opposite end where you may start them on a particular weight, let's say, and so you're talking about someone with more strength-based fiber, glycolytic fiber, and they may be on the machine for 3 repetitions. And then the next day you jump it up, the next workout you jump it up 30 pounds, and they're on for 3 reps. The next time they train 30 more pounds, 3 reps, for a minute or so. And one of my trainers, his name is Scott, he came to New Orleans from California to come and train and be trained. And we got him in here. He was already trained. He was already doing high-intensity training by himself. He had a Nautilus leg extension, Nautilus leg curl, Nautilus pullover. He was doing deadlifts, chin-ups, stuff like that. So he was already trained. When he came in, we put him on the leg extension. He started about 150 pounds. This is about a year and a half later. Scott's now doing 480 on the Med-X leg extension, 480 pounds from 150 with already a trained state. So what we did was to seriously dial in his muscle fiber type distribution and how long he should stay on the machine or the exercise. And his results and strength increase were vastly greater.
So how did you do that? Sorry, I'm curious. How did you? Maybe you're getting to that. So sorry to interrupt.
No, it's totally good. No, I'm glad you asked that question. So what Jones had done in the early days was this was an isokinetic servo powered device that he did the early work on. He would stop the result when they would fatigue just below 75%. So you could say they were training with about 75% of a 1 repetition maximum. Okay. And he noticed that I'm going to send you some clips on some graphics on this and stuff. Okay. But he noticed there was huge variability, that you had some people with 75% of their 1 rep max or on the isokinetic device fatigue in as little as 3 reps, and another subject actually needed 34 repetitions. That would be synonymous to someone with an oxidative profile. So sometimes these things will just come by observation, but if not, one thing that we will do, if it is a trained subject and they have really perfect form and they don't have any injuries, what we'll do is we will test the 1 repetition maximum, but we do this very, very carefully. I'm not a big fan of doing this, and I only do this for clients who I think that are necessary to do this with, okay? We'll warm them up appropriately on the exercises that we choose. Usually I will choose chest press, the Med-X chest press for an upper body, just to give me an idea. I'll choose leg extensions for lower body, and we may later get into like biceps or laterals for biceps or shoulders or something like that. But we'll test their 1 repetition maximum. We'll take 80% of that 1 rep max, make sure their form is absolutely perfect and no momentum is used either in the test or in the training, and have them go to failure. We record the number of repetitions and the amount of time, and that gives us a good ballpark as to where they should fit. And what you see, and this is exactly what Jones had seen, when you train someone who's highly glycolytic or has a high amount of that strength-based fiber, fast glycolytic fibers, they fatigue extremely, extremely quickly. And they generally recover more slowly too. And if you were to train that person as if they were even a standard subject, they make so deep of an inroad that it takes them a much longer time period to recover from. So when you train them accordingly to their fiber type distribution, the results really start to come. And so I'll give you one example why ectomorph, endomorph, mesomorph doesn't really work. We got contacted by this guy, Eric. He's one of Scott's clients. Talked to me on the phone. He read about some of my genetics lecture. This guy could never make results his whole life. He's fairly thin. And, we talked about it. We put him on a standard routine. Didn't make that great results. We did the fatigue response test. And it turned out Eric was extremely glycolytic, no more than 2 or 3 repetitions on each exercise. When we started training him that way for the first time, Eric put on 17 pounds of muscle.
Oh, wow.
And where he's never been able to put on muscle in his life before. So that's big.
That is very significant. What does that mean then? So that he would he then, because like you say, he would very, very glycolytic, so he would have a huge sort of strength force output, and then would he then require, and then he would fatigue an inroad very heavily, and then require a lot of time to recover before he went back to that exercise again?
Yeah, for him, once a week, and we switch up the routines. Also, we will use split routines with people when not, and that's not to train more frequently. That's actually to increase recovery ability. So, but yes, when we started training Eric in that capacity, he improved much greater. If you kept him on the machine for a longer period of time, he's actually creating too deep of an inroad. Or if we just limit inroad to momentary loss of strength. And so if you have someone, let's say, and I've been critical of inroad before, that's another talk we can get into at a different time, but let's say he was using 50% of his max, then he would inroad 50% of his strength, and that's going to require him a much longer recovery ability. And so what at least some of the early work Jones found is that using about 75 to 80% of your max was sort of the way to go when we talked about fatigue or working the failure. And not many of these people are severe outliers, but we do have them. Most people are going to make good results with sort of a standard repetition, standard time under load type scheme. Okay, generally 66% of the population. But you are going to have people that fall outside of those ranges, and they have to be trained accordingly. And if you train them accordingly to their fiber type distribution, you are going to get vastly improved results with that particular individual.
How do you, but when you're, let's say you haven't got a trainer, and take myself for instance, and training by yourself, tracking your own progress, how do you know when things aren't working, and how do you then figure out how to change your protocol, what protocol is going to be more successful for you?
Okay, so basically the first thing is you're going to plateau in strength really, really quickly, and you might even start to go backwards some. That would be the initial sort of symptoms of overtraining. Okay, so as long as you're getting stronger, making strength gains on a fairly consistent basis, we know that you're doing something right. When you're not, something has to be changed. And either you need, we have to go back to that stimulus equals recovery equation and manipulate the intensity, frequency, duration, whatever the case may be. But also, if we test for your fatigue responses, and you could do this on your own as long as you're not training with free weights, let's say, but if you're training with machines, you could, as long as you really focus on, again, the turnarounds and not using momentum, you could test yourself for 1 repetition maximum, take 80% of that, go to failure in that particular exercise, and note the time under load and number of reps. And if you start training accordingly, you're going to make a lot better results. At least that's been our overwhelming observation over these years that we've been doing this.
So that's like an overriding principle. So everyone's obviously one rep max will vary significantly, and the different types of people you get, the different types of sort of genetic variability, like that 1 rep max could vary significantly. So that, as a rule, does that apply to everyone in your experience?
It damn near everyone, yes. Now, this is also really interesting too. Someone who's more oxidative, and this actually goes back to muscle physiology too. oxidative fibers generally tend to be not only more fatigue resistant, but they also tend to be microtrauma resistant. They actually have things like a stronger cytoskeleton, thicker Z disc. And so what I found is having someone who's extremely oxidative not only is keeping them on the machine a much longer time, but they also respond better to more frequent training. There was this one woman, Lori, that I've trained on and off since I was 18 years old. So for 27, almost 28 years now. And we've trained on and off. And she started training with me, and she stayed with me for about a year again after I opened Exercise Science. This is when I had much more knowledge than I did before and much more understanding of inter-individual variability. There are some certain things that you can tell from people, whether they're rather than doing an 80% one rep max. You'll see people who are glycolytic. They're able to get an extreme metabolic response and elevation in heart rate from doing resistance training, where other people won't. I can get my heart rate up to 198 beats per minute, whether I'm doing deadlift, squats, leg press, or leg extension. On row, I get it up to 196. The smaller muscles are going to be less. But I'm getting an extreme metabolic cardiovascular response just from doing the resistance training. Where you're going to see people who are more oxidative, they can literally go to failure and almost, now this is extreme end of the spectrum, okay? And they can almost carry on a conversation if they were doing low intensity endurance training. They simply do not have much of a heart rate response at all. Like literally maybe 100, maybe 110. And so when I trained this woman, Lori, she always did well at endurance training and didn't make really great results from resistance training. I'll send you some photos of her. In her 50s, she was more muscular than she ever had been. I would keep her on the machine. So instead of improving on resistance like a glycolytic subject would do, oxidative subjects improve on time. So let's say you have just 100 pounds on one machine. You go up to, let's say 104, 105, right? It knocks them down on time. So let's say they were on the machine previously for 3 to 4 minutes. You go up even just a little bit, their time under load goes way down. They might get under 2 minutes or around 2 minutes. Then the next workout they come back, you don't go up on resistance, but you wait for them to come up on time. They may literally improve a minute time under load each and every workout. And so it's just been really, really interesting when you train these two opposite ends of the spectrum. But Lori, we did a split routine with her, so we did multiple exercises per muscle group. She did come twice per week. So I do an upper body one day, and then I do legs and spine another day. And she also did some light calisthenics and TRX on some of her days off along with cycling. And I've never seen Lori as muscular since I was training her when I was 17, 18, and she was probably 27 at the time. She made better muscle gain in her 50s with a completely different training routine than she had ever had before.
And just to understand that, so rather than increasing the resistance, it was looking for extending the time under loads is how you would you would measure her progression.
Yeah, we do go up on resistance, but it knocks their time way down. And what boosts their results are that they gain time, not as much as gain increases in weight. Okay. As quickly, I should say.
Okay, so interesting. So going back to the example you gave of your friend Mike, I'm just trying to understand, just trying to wrap my head around all of this. So sure. You mentioned he was doing some sort of high volume approach, and then you brought him into where you were working and, applied your protocol to him, which didn't have any success. Is that because you weren't using that kind of 80% of one rep max rule with him? You weren't really why do you think that is, that didn't work? And can you go sort of elaborate on the protocol if you remember? I know it was a long time ago.
Oh, no, I remember very, very well. Yeah, I was training him as if we were looking for maybe 2-minute time under load. This goes back with some of the early work that Jones did. When he took an oxidative person and he trained them as if they were even a standard subject, one set to failure literally had no effect on inroad. They had like 1% inroad. Their strength didn't suffer whatsoever. If you go back and look at one of the MEDEX books, it's on authorjonesexercise.com, and it was originally called, you could originally only get it from MEDEX. This was in the early 90s. It was called, written by Author Jones, it was called The Lumbar Spine, the Cervical Spine, and the Knee, where he went into what he previously called the anaerobic endurance test, currently, as MEDEX called it, the fatigue response test. When you trained an oxidative person, which should be on the machine for a much longer time under load, or do extra volume training, one set to failure, and they test them again, they were actually stronger. It's almost that initial set with the standard repetition scheme was a warm-up set for them, and they came back stronger rather than weaker. I know it might be hard for you and I to kind of grasp that at first. Wow, if I go to failure with a set, I'm wiped out.
Yeah, there's no way. I can bring it on the second, yeah.
This is actually documented in some of that earlier MEDEX research. It's pretty wild, let's put it that way. And there are people out there that do exist. So if they've come back stronger from doing a set to failure, you haven't fatigued them enough to stimulate a growth response. You haven't created enough microtrauma. And now we can actually look at various genes. There are genes that point to some people are extremely microtrauma resistant, while other people create or experience a lot of microtrauma, even just with a single set of an exercise.
Fascinating. So I'm just imagining this. So after you put him for a workout, was he kind of like, is that it? Like,
yeah, pretty much. I mean, more or less. I mean, he could tell doing the one heavier set slow. Yeah, he felt it much more, but it was like, it didn't really have an effect on him. Where for me, I was toast. I mean, we would just do one workout. We would do chins to all done super slow. Chin-ups I'd do, to failure, and then I'd go to negative failure. So just jumping up, chins, dips, and squats, and I'm toast. I'm on the floor for 45 minutes. And, I'm nauseated. I'm going to vomit if I get up. I feel like I'm going to pass out, where other people just don't experience that response. And for those people like that, not only do they need more time and more volume, but those are the people that also need to do the high-intensity interval training done appropriately for their metabolic response, in order to elicit any type of cardiovascular response from them, because the resistance training just isn't enough alone for them.
Would I be right in saying Mike it sounds like a massive outlier? I mean, I've never seen that. I've never seen anyone respond like that, or not like you. Like you said, like most people, you put them through a proper high intensity training regimen, they are absolutely toast afterwards. They do it properly. So is that fair to say that he is a very rare individual indeed?
I'd say he's an extreme outlier. And the thing is, though, in at least my practice, we do get extreme outliers in. Not the extreme outliers like Mike that do really well, but we'll get extreme outliers who are extremely oxidative and they don't make results from a standard resistance training type program. And we'll get guys who are very glycolytic who have been overtrained. So someone who's very, very oxidative might not be having enough stimulus, right? But someone who's very glycolytic they're going to be overstimulated. And so, yeah, Mike's an outlier, but there are more people like that. Not necessarily like Mike when it comes to hypertrophy, but where I could show you some older women that I train that it blows me away. They'll literally get to failure. They can't do anymore, and they have no metabolic response from it. But yet, if I put them properly on a high-intensity interval training routine, I can get a metabolic and a cardiovascular response.
Going back to that lady you mentioned, not the one you mentioned most recently, but the one you mentioned where you noticed that she did really well on, I think it was 4 minutes when you lowered. That's it. You lowered the resistance, and she did 4 minute time under load.
Mary Lee, yeah, she couldn't budge 140. So 140 was even too heavy to be her 1 rep max. So let's just say we guess at her 1 rep max at 130. Okay. We put her on 120 pounds, and she was on for over 4 minutes. That is a definite example of someone who is extremely oxidative.
Got it. So how did you, I'm interested, how did you then structure her progress going forward? So what was there like okay, so if she exceeds 4 minutes, we up the resistance each workout, or where did you go from there with her exactly?
Yeah, I mean, basically what we're looking at is if she can do 4 minutes in proper form, and then we're going to go up on resistance. And when we do go up on resistance, even a little bit, even like 2 pounds, it knocks her time under load way down. And what they do, so the next workout, let's say we increase from 100 to 104 pounds or 102 pounds. She goes from 4 minutes to like maybe 2 minutes, 10 seconds. And then the workout after that, she gets a little bit over 3 minutes. And then the workout after that, she's back up to her 4 minutes.
That's so interesting. I never found that to be the case with myself. To be able to increase my time under load on a resistance by that amount, but then again, I've always been very quick to increase the resistance as quickly as possible because it's an ego thing, I suppose.
Sure, and Lawrence, you're probably not one of those outliers. And generally, most people who want to strength train or who are interested in it are not going to be those people because they're not strong in general. They're very enduring but not strong. She did this because she knew it's something that she had to do to improve her health and improve her bone density and all this other stuff. So we're starting to see people that are really more concerned about the health aspects of it, and getting into this type of training. And she wasn't a young woman either. And there's stuff we could talk about that at a later date where older subjects, if they don't use their I can actually get muscle biopsies and everything. But literally, as we get older, if we don't use it, we do lose it. And some of those fast twitch motor neurons actually die in the spinal column. And the fibers that were innervated by those fast twitch motor neurons atrophy, while surrounding oxidative fibers sprout new axons and reinnervate those fibers. And I can show you just what that looks like underneath the microscope. And in older muscle, you start to see grouping or clustering. But what the general trend is that if we take muscle biopsies from older subjects and compare those to muscle biopsies of younger subjects have a much higher percentage of glycolytic tissue, where older subjects have a much lower percentage of glycolytic tissue because they've had a transition of those from reinnervating from oxidative fibers, and they have a much higher percentage of that endurance-based tissue. So as we age, if we don't do something to maintain our strength tissue, we actually lose that at a much faster rate than we do the endurance tissue.
Interesting. I just wanted to summarize something you said earlier about we were talking about the crossover design studies with negative responders and non-responders. Is there actually evidence of anyone who's a non-responder? Although I should caveat this by saying I think I remember I think it was a presentation or some literature that said there's no such thing as a non-responder. So maybe it's only if we're talking about certain markers of strength and muscle mass and stuff like that. But are there any non-responders in all categories? So those that didn't respond to anything at all? And if so, what kind of what intervention would you have for that person? I suppose there isn't one. But maybe that doesn't matter if they don't exist.
I've only experienced that. I've only maybe had one or two non-responders. Of course, I didn't know back when. This is a long time ago, when I first started training people, that were non-responders. And I can tell you both were women that were going through menopause. And you had for some very small number of people, there were some extreme variations from workout to workout, where there would be a period of time that they could handle a certain load on, let's say, leg extensions for over 3 minutes. And then the next workout, you come back, they've had sufficient recovery, and you put them, and they can't even budge the weight, the same weight that they did previously for 3 minutes. I only had 2 non-responders, severe non-responders in my training career. I've been able to figure it out for the most part. However, this reflects on another study that it just shows you how powerful genetics are. There is a study, this is an animal model. It was a study that was done inbred training in mice. So what this group of researchers did was they took a litter of mice and they trained them. They took the male and female that responded the best and they mated them. And they took their offspring and trained them. And they took, again, the male and female that responded the best and trained them. And they did that over several generations. I think it was 20 generations. However, they also took the male and female that responded the worst and bred them. Then they trained their offspring. And they took the male and female that responded the worst and they bred them. And you wound up having mice with superior response to exercise, both in the minutes that they would run, the distance that they would run, and the total work that they would run post-training. And then you had, on the other hand, literally couch potato mice. That they put the mouse on the treadmill, and they administered a mild electrical shock, and they still wouldn't move. So you wound up with, on the one hand, people, or mice, I should say, with superior response to exercise, endurance type exercise, and other mice that literally the electrical stimulus was less of a nuisance than actually walking on the treadmill. So what this demonstrates is that genetics are extremely, extremely powerful. It also demonstrates what could take evolution thousands of years to produce, man can produce in a few generations with selective breeding.
In your email, you listed out some of those, which are interleukin-15, myosin light chain kinase,
Yes.
angiotensin converting enzyme, and alpha-actin-3, which I think a lot of the listeners are familiar with, certainly if they've read Body by Science in Chapter 8, I believe.
Yes.
But like you say, I mean, I think it's a really interesting statement you made at the beginning of this, which is any study that doesn't measure this or factor this in is kind of flawed. So could you elaborate on the role of these genes and their importance in terms of how they affect adaptations to training protocols?
Yeah. And this is the thing. So at the time I had given this lecture, this is when 23andMe, the genetics testing lab was just getting up and rolling. And I had contacted them and sent them a good bit of this research literature. And I wanted to come up with a genetics test that was, we could do almost a swab prescribed method of training, or at least give me a really good idea as to what someone's responses may be. First of all, at that time, the genetics testing was very expensive. maybe $600, and they didn't look at enough genes for exercise performance. They were only testing maybe one. And there are more companies in the U.S. now that claim to test for genetic performance, or athletic performance is what they're calling it. But they only measure one or two genes, and that is just not enough information to tell me, because since I've given this lecture, we've discovered more genes, and we understand how they actually work much better. There is a company, I believe in Sweden, the last I looked, they were testing a lot more genes, even more than I would necessarily need, but they were looking at like maybe 900 euros. And I just can't see many of my clients wanting to spend that much money. I mean, I might spend it just because I'm curious, for my own curiosity on myself. But so let's look at some of these individual genes. And I was talking to one of my clients about this earlier today. Telling him I was going to do this podcast with you. Interleukin 15 was one of the first ones I looked at. And this just kind of blew my mind. Okay, so genes express themselves in different ways. If you remember back to high school biology, you had what was called a Punnett square. You tried to figure out eye color. That was dominant recessive, right? So like brown eyes are the dominant trait, right? And so if you have, let's say, one big B from your mom and one big B from your dad, you're definitely going to be brown eye. If you had one big B from your dad and one little b from your mom, you'd still have brown eyes. The little b would be blue. The only way to get the blue condition would be two little b's, okay? And so that's dominant recessive, but many genes don't express themselves that way. They express themselves as codominance or shared dominance, which is the blending of the two traits. And that's usually what we'll see in most genes. I mean, eye color is one of those where the phenotype is directly determined by the genotype. But many genotypes or phenotypes are determined by genotype environmental interactions. So, example, for muscle mass and strength, it would be what is your genotype plus your workout program. Okay. When I looked at this research on interleukin 15, they divided these subjects into genotypes are usually three. Okay, we usually have three states of a gene. All right, one is called the homozygote wild type. You'll have a blending of the two traits, which is the heterozygote condition. And then if it's less than 18 or 20% of a population, it's thought to be the mutant or the mutated circumstance. Okay, so they divided interleukin 15 up into the three genotypes. Right, CC was one group, CA was another group, and AA was the other genotype group. And they put them on resistance training programs. And they looked at not just strength gains, but they looked at mass gains. So they looked at a total of lean mass, total arm circumference, and total leg circumference. And then they looked at strength gains, arm strength, leg strength. They came up with something called arm muscle quotient and leg muscle quotient. The thing that really surprised me the most about this is that the genotype that gained the most amount of muscle mass actually gained the least amount of strength. And the genotype that gained the most amount of strength gained the least amount of mass. Of course, you had the heterozygote trait, which is a blending of the two traits. But this really blew my mind. And it actually blew the researchers' mind, too. So the conclusion of the study was that in the past, hypertrophy has been considered the ideal response to resistance training and cellular studies of muscle growth. But muscle quality has been examined more recently to reflect a measure of mass to performance efficiency ratio. If neurological and biochemical adaptations are not sufficient to respond to the overload stimulus, hypertrophy may be a compensating adaptation. So if you think of this from an evolutionary standpoint or efficiency standpoint point of view, the group that gained the most amount of mass was actually a mutant condition. So from an evolutionary standpoint, your body would want to add as little mass per possible of unit per strength. That's efficiency. Muscle mass is metabolically active tissue. It requires protein and calories to keep it alive. So if you could become strong without becoming big, that would be considered an advantage.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting, and it's funny because it's very ironic, isn't it, that you've got a lot of skinny guys running around out there who want to look like the big guys, but you know they have a survival advantage, right? So
absolutely, most of us are superior results of natural selection. But just think if we had a test. I mean, if some guy comes in and he says, "Man, like me when I was a kid, I want to look like that. I want to be a bodybuilder." Well, we do a swab, prescribe. Dude, if you don't have the proper genotype for interleukin 15, you're going to be beating your head against the wall. You're just not going to look like that. It allows us to have a more realistic outcome and expectation of results from exercise with our clients.
Yeah, no, it'd be great when that kind of technology and opportunity becomes available to the masses. So what I'm trying to wrap my head around is those that do hypertrophy but don't perhaps gain as much strength, are they still going because of their is their base level strength still that much higher that they're still going to be a lot stronger than those that don't seem to be able to put a lot of muscle on?
Actually, that's a negative. No, they were not as strong necessarily. That's a different gene that we would have to look at, called myosin light chain kinase.
Right.
And so this is an extremely interesting gene to me. So what myosin light chain kinase genotype does is it phosphorylates myosin's regulatory light chain. The more regulatory light chain an individual has, the more binding between actin and myosin protein, contractile protein filaments. Okay? So if you have more binding between actin and myosin, you're going to be stronger, right? So individuals with more regulatory light chain are stronger even before a resistance training program than people with less than the genotype with less regulatory light chain. However, they have the capability to get so strong and so much binding between those actin and myosin that they actually are much more susceptible to exercise-induced microtrauma, where the genotype that's not as strong has a blunted response to microtrauma. As a matter of fact, for the TT genotype, that would be the genotype that has more binding, more regulatory light chain, so they're actually stronger to start out with. They're able to create more strength, but they create much more damage at the same time. And if you look at the creatine kinase activity, which is a marker of protein tissue damage, and myoglobin activity in the blood, they're actually bordering on the line of physiologically dangerous. Not quite to the level of rhabdomyolysis, but close. Where the other genotypes actually have a blunted response. So with this TT genotype, as opposed to the CC, you're not going to need much volume at all. Matter of fact, they cannot stand much volume at all. It only takes a little bit of exercise to stimulate microtrauma and stimulate muscle protein synthesis than the ones that were more resistant to damage. The ones that are more resistant to damage are going to probably need to do a little bit more volume in order to acquire the same amount of microtrauma needed to stimulate an adaptive response.
We're going to have to do a round two, Ryan. I'm going to have to listen all the way through this just to get my head around some of the stuff we've spoken about, because we've only really touched on one section of my my questions here, and I know that listening to this again, I'm going to be able to come up with a lot of follow-up questions just so I can make sense of everything, because it is a very complicated subject that you seem to know a lot about. Obviously, dedicated a lot of your career to to learning more and more about it. It's very impressive. But I just wanted to ask you one more question before we wrap up. Would you be keen to do a round two at some point to, I guess, go into some of the other areas we haven't been able to talk about?
Absolutely, Lawrence. I'd be actually very excited. I've been wanting to get this stuff out for a very long time. And there's only a few people that actually have seen it or read the really brief stuff in Body by Science, but there's much more depth to it. I'd love to.
I feel like we're just warming up, which is a shame. I've got a bit of a hard stop, 9 p.m. my time, but we'll definitely do a round two, and perhaps we can make it a longer session so that we can really get into some of this stuff a bit more. What is so final question? Obviously, I'll ask you to share your sort of main contact information in a second. But what have you changed your mind about in the last year regarding exercise, if anything?
I thought about this for a good bit, and I wouldn't say it's been in the last year, but I would say it's been in the last 3 years. Mm-hmm. I really, really think it's extremely important, and you don't see this all that much, that individuals, especially as we age, but almost at any age, is to strengthen the muscles that support and protect the spine. So we've had so many positive results from doing our Medix line of spine care technology, particularly the Medix lumbar extension, which isolates the muscles of the lumbar spine, the cervical extension, the rotary torso. That has been extremely helpful for us in a lot of rehabilitative circumstances, and what I like to call prehabilitative is if those muscles are strong, you're going to be much more damage resistant if you're in a car accident or whiplash or whatever the case may be. So there's so many guys that focus on vanity muscles, chest and biceps, right, hips and thighs for women, but they don't really think about the more important muscles that protect those vital structures.
And what type of exercise do you recommend for focusing on those areas? So what are your kind of top 3 exercises for those?
So, it's difficult to get to those if you don't have access to the properly designed machines. You pretty much are going to need a Medix lumbar, right, that isolates or has the pelvic restraint mechanism. You can get some of that from doing, what's the hyperextensions they used to call them, where you lie off of a table or something. You'll get a little bit of that, not nearly to the same extent. There has been some research looking at people who, after finishing their Medix therapy, were recommended to do the hyperextensions and off the table or I can't remember what that bench was called at one point in time, but they were able to maintain some strength on the lumbar extensors, cervical extension. We have the Medix cervical extension, but if not, you could either do manual resistance neck extensions, or probably maybe on some. I've seen some people try to attempt it on maybe like a Smith machine with a head pad or something, or a neck pad, what you would do for squats. It's not perfect like a properly designed tool would be, but at least it's something.
What about so I'm currently doing prone trunk extensions where you're lying on the floor with your hands out in front, and then are you familiar with that exercise? I assume.
Yeah,
probably have to describe it.
That would be a static contraction for the lumbar extensors mostly. Mm-hmm. You're not going through you're going through a very, very little range of motion. And if there's not an eccentric component in a fatigue state to the exercise, there's going to be little stimulus for a hypertrophic response. That eccentric component is very, very important for a number of reasons that we'll probably have to get into in round 2. Obviously, there's some adaptation that can occur even when you're doing deadlifts, for example. Your that your lumbar extensors usually feel fatigue first, but they go through a static contraction. And the muscles of the hips and thighs, hamstrings, do the vast majority of the work. And MEDX has some of this research literature where they had people that were very, very strong on deadlift and other type of exercises, but were exceedingly weak in other parts of the range of motion of the MEDX lumbar. And so it's really unbelievable. I mean, I've seen some pretty big guys who can hardly lift any weight in that flexed position on the MEDX lumbar machine. I'm talking about really tiny amounts of weight because they just have never actually touched those muscles. Those muscles usually stay weak and atrophied even when doing something like deadlifting or other type of lower back machines without pelvic restraint.
No, I know the machine you refer to, and I miss using it very, very much. I used it in Keyser training in London, and it's a wonderful machine, so well designed. Yep. But alas, I have
Not
to.
everybody has.
Yeah. Ryan, what is the best way for people to find out more about you and get in touch?
So if you go to the website, which is exercisesciencellc.com, that'll give all the contact information. They can contact us through any of the social media. We have some videos on YouTube. We have a Facebook page. Obviously Twitter too, and all that stuff. Go to the website is probably the easiest way. There's our email addresses of all of our trainers. There's my personal cell phone number. Anybody's welcome to call whenever they need to. Contact us anyway, either through email, text, voice. It doesn't matter.
Cool. Sounds good. Thanks for sharing all that. And for everyone listening, to find the show notes for this episode and all episodes, please go to 15minutecorporatewarrior.com/podcast. And Ryan, thanks very much for taking the time today to come on. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface, so I will reach out to you to arrange a round two very soon at your convenience, and look forward to talking to you again.
Would love to, Lawrence. Thank you so much.
Cool. You're welcome, Ryan. Talk to you soon. Take care.
Before you head off, for a free ebook with 6 interview transcriptions with world-class performers on how to optimize productivity and health and fitness, and weekly updates from me on the latest podcasts and blog updates, head on over to 15minutecorporatewarrior.com/ebook. That's 15minutecorporatewarrior.com/ebook, and enter your email address for instant access.